Fichamento literal do livro PSYCHOGEOGRAPhy de Merlin Coverley, da editora Old Castle Books. Quote, Psychogeography, a term which has become strangely familiar, strange because despite the frequency of its usage, no one seems quite able to pin down exactly what it means or where it comes from. End quote. Page 13. Quote, under the stewardship of Guy Debord, psychogeography became a tool in an attempt to transform urban life, first for aesthetic purposes, but later for increasingly political ends. End quote. Page 14. Quick note, we have the sum of aesthetics plus politics. Okay. Quote, psychogeography is the point at which psychology and geography collide, a means of calibrating the behavioral impact of life. End quote. Page 14. Quick note, isn't that something important to environmental psychology, for example? Okay. Quote, the reason why psychogeography often seems so nebulous and resistant to definition is that it appears to harbor within it such a welter of seemingly unrelated elements. End quote. Page 15. Quote, characteristics. The first and most prominent of these is the activity of walking. The wanderer, the stroller, the flaneur, the stalker. The names may change from the situationist Derive to the heroic tracks of Ian Sinclair. The act of walking is principally an urban affair, and in cities that are often hostile to the pedestrian, it inevitably becomes an act of subversion. End quote. Page 16. Open quote. Psychogeography also demonstrates a playful sense of provocation and trickery. With its roots in the avant-garde activities of the Dadaists and Surrealists, psychogeography and its practitioners provide a history of ironic humor. End quote. Page 16. Open quote. An obsession with the occult is allied to an antiquarianism that views the present through the prism of the past and which results in psychogeographical research that increasingly contrasts a horizontal movement with a vertical descent through its past. This entire project is then further colored by an engagement with the occult, and is one that is as preoccupied with excavating the past as it is with recording the present. End quote. Page 17 to 18. Just a quick note, we have this dialectics between present and past in this excerpt. Okay, open quote. Defoe's contribution to the history of psychogeography is twofold. His novel, Robinson Crusoe, from 1719, releases a character that links Defoe both to the flaneur as well as to more recent incarnations of the urban wanderer in the films of Patrick Taylor and elsewhere. End quote. Page 19. Open quote. An urban wanderer, moving aimlessly across the city before reporting back with his observations, has since become a crucial part of the psychogeography practice. End quote. Page 19. Open quote. The sense of an eternal landscape underpinning our own is more commonly described as a kind of historical consciousness that exposes the psychic connectivity of landscapes, both urban and rural. End quote. Page 20. Open quote. If Defoe and Blake provide the imaginative impetus for psychogeographical ideas, it is Thomas de Quincey who stands as their first actual practitioner. End quote. Page 20. Just a quick note, so we kind of have the genesis of psychogeographical thought here, so It's really important. Okay, open quote. For De Quincey, the city becomes a riddle, a puzzle still perplexing writers and walkers to this day, in which the city becomes a dreamscape, in which nothing is as it seems, only to be navigated by those possessing secret knowledge. Open quote. In Paris, the figure of the solitary stroller who both records and comes to symbolize the emergence of the modern city has a name, the flaneur. End quote, page 22. Open quote. Baudelaire and Walter Benjamin, in whose work the flaneur was first identified. End quote, page 23. Open quote. The flaneur symbolizes both the birth of the modern city and the destruction of his former home. The fate of the flaneur is then inseparable from the fate of the city he inhabits. End quote, page 23. Open quote. Robinsonner, meaning to travel mentally. End quote, page 24. Open quote. The rise of the flaneur and the history of the urban wanderer in Paris may then be characterized as a process of political awakening. End quote, page 25. Open quote. The first issue of the letterist journal Potlatch in June 1954 contained a psychogeographical game of the week. This was soon followed by Potlatch number 2 and Guy Debord's exercise in psychogeography. End quote, page 25. Open quote. The Practice of Everyday Life, 1980. Taking New York as his subject, Michel de Certeau provides a useful distinction between the street-level gaze of the walker and the panoptical perspective of the voyeur. End quote, page 27. Open quote. It is around the Sinclair-Ackroyd axis that most London writing, psychogeographic or otherwise, now appears to rotate. End quote, page 29. Open quote, page 31. The terminology employed to describe such activities has mutated, from mythogeography to schizocartography, even to cyclogeography, in which, with a degree of inevitability, the walker is finally usurped by the cyclist. Thankfully, the car is yet to be employed in this capacity, although in his own unique take on psychogeography, Will Self has managed to insert both train and air travel into his long-distance pedestrian itineraries. End quote. Open quote. Despite the global recognition it now enjoys, psychogeography remains indissolubly associated with a particular time and place, Paris in the 1950s. However, as soon as one looks beyond the narrow context out which it arose, it becomes clear that psychogeography is retrospectively supported or undermined by earlier traditions which have been neglected or willfully obscured. End quote, page 34. Open quote. William Blake, described by Ian Sinclair as the godfather of psychogeography. End quote, page 35. Open quote. Ackroyd and history and identity converge. Just as it seems possible to me that a street or dwelling can materially affect the character and behavior of the people who live within them, it is not also possible that within our sensibility and our language there are patterns of continuity and resemblance which have persisted from the 13th or 14th centuries, and perhaps even beyond that. And is it not possible that in outlining what I consider to be a Burdick Catholic tradition, such a pattern can be seen to emerge? End quote, pages 36 to 37. Open quote. It is the figure of Daniel Defoe who inaugurates London's psychogeographical tradition. Defoe was the first writer to offer a vision of London shaped according to his own imaginary topography, and in his most famous work, Robinson Crusoe, pages 37 to 38. Okay. So, open quote on page 42. Blake was a walker, a wanderer whose poems describe the reality of 18th century street life, but which are overlaid by his own intensely individualistic, imaginative vision to create a new and transcendent topography of the city. End quote, page 42. Open quote. The mental traveler who remakes the city in accordance with his own imagination is allied to the urban wanderer who drifts through the city streets. The political radicalism that seeks to overthrow the established order of the day is tempered by an awareness of the city as eternal and unchanging. And the use of occult symbolism reflects the precedence given to the subjective and the anti-rational over more systematic modes of thought. End quote, page 43. So, moving on. Open quote. Thomas de Quincey may be described as psychogeography's first actual practitioner. End quote, page 44. Open quote. For de Quincey, however, the Northwest Passage was symbolic of his journey through the city, a voyage of discovery through which the secrets of the city could be exposed and a path out of the labyrinth revealed. End quote, page 47. Open quote. Psychogeographical Venice. We must recognize in Thomas de Quincey an undeniable precursor to psychogeographical derives. Perhaps there exists a more irrational tendency, a tendency to expect the discovery of a kind of psychogeographical great passage, beyond which we will attain mastery of a new game, the adventures of our lives themselves. End quote, page 48. Open quote. De Quincey's drifts would fascinate the situationist, his attempts to find a channel through and out of the city, overcoming any impediment to his passage, mirroring their own attempts to navigate a similar route through Paris almost 150 years later. End quote, page 48. Open quote. London as a twofold city in which outward privilege masks poverty and despair. End quote, page 49. Open quote. I think it is easier to discern the secret beauty and wonder and mystery in humble and common things than in the splendid and noble and storied things. End quote. Open quote. The matter of our work is everywhere present. End quote. Page 53. Open quote. There is a London cognita and a London incognita. End quote. Page 54. Just a quick note. Does it apply to all big cities? For example, São Paulo, does it have like an incognito too? And what makes it an incognita? So, moving on. Open quote. It is this element of his work, the desire deliberately to lose oneself in the city, open to the unexpected and wondrous experiences that may be found there, which makes Machen so appealing a figure to today's generation of urban wanderers. End quote, page 55. Open quote. Machen's act of resistance was a highly personal one, entirely free from political allegiance and quite unconcerned with intellectual or literary fashion. End quote. Page 55 as well. Open quote. In his essay Secret City, Psychogeography and the End of London, Phil Baker identifies two strands of psychogeographical thought. On the one hand, the history of the flaneur celebrated by Baudelaire and Benjamin, which, via the surrealists, culminates in Debord and the Situationists. And on the other, what he calls the Earth Mystery School, the tradition of esoteric and New Age thinking which resurfaced in the 1960s, but which has its roots in the theory of ley lines developed in the 1920s. So, end quote, page 57. Open quote. Ley lines are hypothetical alignments of places of geographical or religious significance, such as ancient monuments and megaliths. So, end quote, pages 57 to 58. Open quote. In what he was later to describe as a flood of ancestral memory, Watkins at once recognized that this familiar landscape was covered by a vast network of straight tracks, aligned through hills, mounds, and other landmarks. Coining the term ley to describe these alignments, apparently because they pass so frequently through towns with names ending in syllable ley. So, end quote, page 58. Moving on, open quote. The exact nature of this force or power remains unclear, but this reworking of Watkins' original notion mirrors the broader reinterpretation of psychogeography itself, as it becomes entangled amidst confusion of esoteric ideas, bear little, if any, resemblance to the Baud's original conception. Well, end quote, page 61. Okay. Open quote. Flaneur. Errait sans but en s'arrêtant pour regarder. Its derivation has been traced back both to the Old Scandinavian flana, to run giddily here and there, and to the Irish term for libertine. End quote. Page 67. Well, about the origin of the word flaneur. Open quote. The flaneur remains inextricably linked with the streets of Paris and the poetry of Charles Baudelaire. End quote, page 68. Open quote. The crowd is his element, as the air is that of the birds and water of fishes. His passion in his profession are to become one flesh with the crowd. For the perfect flaneur, for a passionate spectator, it is an immense joy to set up house in the heart of the multitude, amid the ebb and flow of movement, in the midst of the fugitive and the infinite. To be away from home and yet to find oneself everywhere at home. To see the world, to be at the center of the world, and yet remain hidden from the world. Such are a few of the slightest pleasures of these independent, passionate, impartial natures which the tongue can but clumsily define. End quote, page 68. Open quote. The flaneur is a nostalgic figure who, while proclaiming the wonders of urban life, also acknowledges the changes that threaten to make the idle pedestrian redundant. End quote, page 69. Open quote. As Rebecca Solnit has noted, the only problem with the flaneur is that he did not exist except as a type, an ideal, and a character in literature. No one quite fulfilled the idea of the flaneur, but everyone engaged in some version of flânerie. End quote, page 71. Interesting. Open quote. The navigation of the city becomes a skill, a secret knowledge available only to an elect few, and in this environment the stroller is transformed into an explorer, or even a detective solving the mystery of the city streets. As public spaces become private ones and the streets become choked with traffic, so walking is reduced to mere promenading, explorers becoming little more than window shoppers. In modern city, the man of the crowd must adapt or perish. End quote. Page 72. Open quote. The streets become more hostile to the stroller whose insistence upon a walker space questions the need for speed and circulation that the modern city promotes, yet seldom achieves. End quote. Page 72. Open quote. Benjamin returns repeatedly to Baudelaire in his identification of the flaneur as symbolic of a bygone age. End quote. Page 74. Open quote. The flaneur, Benjamin writes, is someone who does not feel comfortable in his own company. That is why he seeks out the crowd. Baudelaire loved solitude, he adds, but he wanted it in a crowd. Benjamin's portrait of Baudelaire reveals a tragic figure, one who is both attracted and at the same time alienated by the crowd. End quote. Page 75. Open quote. Edmund White noted that to be a successful flaneur required time, the kind of freedom that enjoyed by those unencumbered by the need to work, those who can take off a morning or an afternoon for undirected ambling. End quote. Pages 76 to 77. Open quote. Benjamin was to become the flaneur's flaneur, not merely the observer of the crowd, but the observer of the flaneur himself. End quote. Page 77. Open quote. Female counterpart. The flaneuse. And the flaneur principally represented freedom, a kind of freedom which was, however, largely denied to women. End quote. Page 77. Open quote. Ultimately, the flaneur is a composite figure, vagrant, detective, explorer, dandy, and stroller. Within these many, often contradictory roles, his predominant characteristic is the way in which he makes the street his home. The cities he inhabits become increasingly hostile. End quote. Page 78. Open quote. Would even the most indolent of men, he asks, hesitate to set off with me in search of a pleasure that will cost him neither effort nor money? End quote. Page 79. Moving on. Open quote. I'm convinced that a traveler on foot sees many things that escape a man who travels with the post. End quote. Page 82. Same page. Open quote. That the pleasure we derive from journeys is perhaps dependent more on the mindset with which we travel than on the destination we travel to. End quote. Open quote. The Master's sedentary journey, an early example, if not the earliest, of stationary travel, anticipates the fate of the flaneur, forced to withdraw from the street and now reduced to circling his room. End quote. Page 83. Open quote. Rimbaud's peripatetic existence has been well documented, but his lesser-known contribution to the realms of imaginary travel is memorialized in the verb Robinsoner, coined by Rimbaud himself, and meaning to let the mind wander, or to travel mentally. Isolation and the imaginary voyage. End quote. Page 85. Open quote. Rimbaud's Robinsoner is born of these experiences on the streets of London. End quote. Page 86. Moving on. Open quote. According to Carreri, the link between walking and art is such that for the entire first part of the 20th century, walking was experienced as a form of anti-art. End quote, page 90. Open quote. The Dadaists, passing through Paris as a remedy for the incompetence of guides and dubious pedants, have decided to undertake a series of visits to selected places, in particular to those places that do not truly have any reason to exist. So upgrading the role of the flaneur from disinterested observer to participant in an aesthetic experiment, the Dadaists hoped to attribute symbolism to the act of walking, which would transfer artistic value away from the realm of objects toward space and performance. End quote, page 91. Open quote. If we're looking for the text that will bridge the gap between the playful practices of the avant-garde and the revolutionary politics of the Situationists, then it is to be found in Aragon's Paris Peasant. Unlike Nadia and The Last Nights of Paris, both of which are principally dictated by sexual desire and the search for the eternal female. End quote, page 95. Just a quick note. So, do we have a psychoanalytic point of view? So, open quote. Paris Peasant remains, however, alongside Nadia and The Last Nights of Paris, as a memorial to a way of life under threat. End quote, page 100. Open quote. What surrealism in general, and these books in particular, were to emphasize was the fact that the idle stroller could no longer stand at the wayside or retreat to his armchair, but must now face up to the destruction of his city. The streets were radicalized as never before, and revolutionary change was in the air. If the urban wanderer was to continue his aimless strolling, then walking must become an act of subversion, a means of reclaiming the streets for the pedestrian. End quote. Pages 100 and 101. Yes. So now about Guy Debord and the Situationist International. Open quote. Dérive was a flow in which protagonists embarked upon a surrealist trip, a dreamy trek through varied Parisian passageways, forever on foot, wandering for hours, usually at night, identifying subtle moods and nuances of neighborhoods. Through these real and imagined perambulations, situationists become latter-day flaneurs. Aimless urban strollers weren't quite so aimless. End quote. Page 109. Open quote. These movements continue to proclaim the need for a new society, free from the hegemonizing effects of capitalist development. But it was only with the emergence of the Situationist International in 1957, under the firm, if not tyrannical, grip of Guy Debord, that a momentum for change began to appear. End quote, page 110. Open quote. Indeed, psychogeography barely merits a mention in the two major theoretical statements of the Situationist movement. The Society of the Spectacle, 1967, and Ho Vannegam's The Revolution of Everyday Life, 1967 as well. End quote, page 110. Open quote. Michel Desserteaux, his The Practice of Everyday Life, 1980, provides a useful postscript to Situationist psychogeography. End quote, page 111. Open quote. All cities are geological. You cannot take 3 steps without encountering ghosts bearing all the prestige of their legends. We move within a closed landscape whose landmarks constantly draw us toward the past. Certain shifts, angles, certain receding perspectives allows us to glimpse original conceptions of space, but this vision remains fragmentary. It must be sought in the magical locales of fairy tales and surrealist writings, castles, endless walls, Little Forgotten Bars, Mammoth Caverns, Casino Mirrors. End quote. Page 112. Quick note. Cities can reveal their ghosts, and those closed landscapes draw us to the past. And Coquelin says the same about landscapes. It has this ability of revealing its heritage. But things are all fragmentary, and it seems like Flannery can solve the puzzles. Okay, moving on. Open quote. A mental disease has swept the planet. Banalization. End quote. Page 112. Quick note. This is central within the Situationist. That's the spectacle summed up. Moving on. Open quote. The Lettrist International was a product of the earlier Lettrist movement, formed in 1948, and Cheglov's formulary is the first significant monument to a movement that Stuart Home has described as undoubtedly ludicrous. End quote. Page 113. Open quote. Potlatch harks back to the playful practices of the Dadaists and displays little concern for the theoretical rigors that Du Bois was soon to enforce. End quote. Page 115. Open quote. The word psychogeography, suggested by an illiterate Kabyle as a general term for the phenomena a few of us were investigating around the summer of 1953, is not too inappropriate. It does not contradict the materialist perspective of the conditioning of life and thought by objective nature. Geography, for example, deals with the determinate action of general natural forces, such as soil, composition, or climatic conditions, on the economic structures of a society, and thus on the corresponding conception that such a society can have of the world. Psychogeography could set for itself the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. The adjective psychogeographical, retaining a rather pleasing vagueness, can thus be applied to the findings arrived at by this type of investigation, to their influence on human feelings, and even more generally to any situation or conduct that seems to reflect the same spirit of discovery. End quote. Pages 115, 116. That's the board's definition. Open quote. Here we have an experiment to be conducted under scientific conditions and whose results are to be rigorously analyzed. The emotional and behavioral impact of urban space upon individual consciousness is to be carefully monitored and recorded. Its results are to be used to promote the construction of a new urban environment. End quote, page 116. Just a quick note. But how can we promote it? Like through public policies? And first of all, how to validate those results in order to promote the construction of a new urban? Open quote. Psychogeography, claims the board, is a science, and the psychogeography, like the skilled chemist, is able to identify and distill the varied ambiances of his environment. The principle, too, at the psychogeographer's disposal is the aimless drift, or dérive, which enables its practitioner to ascertain the true nature of the urban environment as he passes through it. Hence, emotional zones that cannot be determined simply by architectural or economic conditions must be revealed by the dérive, the results of which may then form of the basis of a new cartography characterized by a complete disregard for the traditional and habitual practices of the tourist. End quote, page 117. Just a quick note. According to the board, so psychogeography equals science. The technique is the dérive, and the technical instrument and or final products are the psychogeographical maps. This is important. Open quote. The production of psychogeographical maps, or even the introduction of alterations, such as more or less arbitrarily transposing maps of two different regions, can contribute to clarifying certain wanderings that express not subordination to randomness, but complete insubordination to habitual influences. Influences generally categorized as tourism, the popular drug as repugnant as sports or buying on credit. A friend recently told me that he had just wandered through the Harz region of Germany while blindly following the directions of a map of London. This sort of game is obviously only a mediocre beginning in comparison to the complete construction of architecture and urbanism that will someday be within the power of everyone. Meanwhile, we can distinguish several stages of partial, less difficult realizations, beginning with the mere displacement of elements of decoration from the location where we are used to seeing them. End quote, page 118, that's Debord's quotation. Just a quick note, maybe we have a contradiction here. He calls a dérive from his friend as a game, even though he states that dérive works as a method, like a technique to scientific psychogeography. Perhaps he hasn't been clear enough by stating that psychogeography is not only a science, but also an ordinary practice to be experienced by anyone. Open quote. The dérive does not demonstrate the pure submission to a conscious desire that characterized the surrealist wanderings of the journeys of the strolling flaneur. End quote, page 123. Quick note, maybe the flaneur would be more interesting to psychoanalysis. I don't know, perhaps both. Considering its scientific approach in the dériveur's investigation, plus its political role. Open quote. The dérive takes the wanderer out of the realm of the disinterested spectator or artistic practitioner and places him in a subversive position as a revolutionary following a political agenda. End quote, page 124. Quick note, the dérive is not a deriva in Portuguese. It has an interest, an active, subversive one. The subject, in this case, is a political unity. Open quote. The board suggesting that the dérive should be conducted in small groups of 2 or 3 people and observing that its average duration is a single day, although acknowledging that one sequence of dérives lasted for around 2 months. For some, the dérive could become the work of a lifetime. End quote. Page 125. Open quote. If you put me in an unknown town, I will find the place where I should be. End quote. Page 125. That's the board. And just something quick, that's actually psychogeography final goal, maybe. Open quote. It is 1958. Paris is ripe for revolutionary change. While the theoretical and instructive elements of psychogeography are manifest, the actual results of all these experiments are strangely absent. End quote, pages 126 to 127. Quick note, but what results have been expected in the first place? Is it like a new urban overcoming the old one? Open quote. Situationism is today much better known for its emphasis on revolutionary politics than for its cultural component. End quote, page 128. Open quote. The bar came to recognize the essentially personal nature of the relationship between the individual and the city. The secrets of the city are, at a certain level, decipherable, he wrote, but the personal meaning they have for us is incommunicable. End quote, page 129. Just a quick note. This difficulty in communicating, in accessing just only at a certain level, is shared in common with Cora in Plato, This is really important. Open quote. The urban wanderer has been subordinate to the dictatorship of the automobile. As a new urban landscape emerges, a known place dominated by technology and advertising whose endless reflective surfaces are devoid of all individuality. End quote, page 130. Just a quick note again, we have, this debauched, strong possibilities of dialogue with Merlin Coverley, who wrote about the known places. And it's interesting to see how known places are a thing here, but perhaps they're impossible according to Colin Allard, for example. This seems like an ideological concept. I don't know. Okay, moving on. Open quote. Passive adventurers are more sensitive explorers, more cerebral, more studious and solitary, reading a lot and dreaming often. Passive adventuring is an art form, a question of intellectual gymnastics, understanding everyday exercises and practicing the methodology of imagination. End quote, page 131, Merrifield quotation. Just a question, are flaneurs such passive adventurers? Moving on to the last chapter about psychogeography today. Today, psychogeography remains alert to the increasing banalization of our urban environment that preoccupy the situationists, and it continues to provide a political response to the perceived failures of urban governance. End quote, page 142. Just a quick note, but what's left for psychogeography if not the banalized urban? Moving on, open quote. To devise your own system of walking in London isn't easy. It requires resolve and maybe even perversity. End quote. Page 150, Geoff Nicholson's quotation. Just a quick note. What kind of perversity is that? Is it applied to other metropolises? Moving on, open quote. If there is one person, more than any other, who is responsible for the popularity that psychogeography now enjoys, then it is Ian Sinclair. Born in Wales but resident of London for the last 15 years, much of Sinclair's work over this period falls within the boundaries of what he calls his London Project, a series of poems and novels, as well as documentary studies and films, which celebrate London's overlooked and neglected spaces, heavily indebted both to the surrealist drift of Breton and Aragon, and to the visionary tradition of London writers from William Blake to Arthur Machen. End quote, page 151. Open quote. Alongside Sinclair's occult preoccupations, the single activity with which his work is most closely associated is that of walking. End quote, page 152. Open quote. Walking is the best way to explore and exploit the city. The changes, shifts, breaks in the cloud helmet, movements of light on water. Flaneur is a stubborn creature, less interested in texture and fabric, eavesdropping on philosophical conversation pieces than in noticing everything. End quote, page 145, Sinclair quote again. Alright, open quote. The flaneur has evolved. The bystander is now participant. The aimless drift has given way to a more purposeful mode of travel. The stroller has become the stalker. End quote, page 154. Open quote. The concept of strolling, aimless urban wandering, the flaneur, had been superseded. We had moved into the age of the stalker. Journeys made with intent, sharp-eyed and unsponsored. The stalker was our role model. Purpose hiking, not dawdling nor browsing. The stalker is a stroller who sweats, a stroller who knows where he's going, but not why or how. End quote. That's Sinclair quotation. Just a quick note, it's very important to disguise both figures. To state the difference between both the stroller and the stalker, because it marks an epistemological difference. Both validly represent different contexts and approaches to think psychogeography, although Sinclair is assuming his preference here. Open quote, the surrealist Stroh. I liked the notion of it, he claims, but it wasn't exactly what I was doing. I liked their notion of finding strange parks at the edge of the city, creating a walk that would allow you to enter into a fiction. By the time I was using the term, it was more like a psychotic geographer. End quote, page 155. Open quote. As always with Sinclair, the walk requires no justification, no excuses. It is a wholly self-fulfilling activity which accepts the implicit challenge presented by an environment so overtly hostile to the pedestrian. End quote, page 156. Open quote. Walk as itself symptomatic of madness, a state of fugue. I tried to explain my notion of walk as a fugue. Then I found the term fugueur more attractive than the now overworked flâneur. Fugueur was the right job description for our walk, our episodes of transient mental illness. The walker becomes a control freak, compulsively logging distances, directions. End quote. Pages 156, 157. Just some quick notes. Like, fugueur is like a fugitive, but is the psychogeographer running away from something? Is this subject running away from something? Isn't the fugueur the psychotic geographer that Sinclair had mentioned before? And I think here we have like some possible dialogues with psychoanalysis again. Open quote. I'm not really there when I'm walking, confesses Sinclair, acknowledging that what he describes as ambulatory amnesia. End quote, page 157. Well, walking is a hypnotic exercise. Open quote. For me, it's a way of psychoanalyzing the psychosis of the place in which I happen to live. End quote, page 157. The psychogeographer is the psychotic psychoanalyst. The city is the patient. This is so interesting to think about. Open quote. To be fair with Ackroyd, however, he would certainly not describe himself as a psychogeographer. It is, claims Ackroyd, this latter, irrational, even sacred impulse, which reveals the city as it truly is, allowing its adherents even today to recognize the magical that underlies the mundane. End quote, page 160. Just the last here. The irrational pulsation in a psychogeographic exercise revealed the mundane. But I think I gotta think better about this mundanity. Terminology section from the original excerpt. Open quote. Situationist. Having to do with the theory or practical activity of constructing situations. One who engages in the construction of situations. End quote. Page 120. Open quote. Situationism. A meaningless term improperly derived from the above. End quote. Page 120. Open quote. Psychogeography. The study of the specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. End quote, page 120. Open quote. Psychogeographical. Relating to psychogeography. That which manifests the geographical environment's direct emotion effects. End quote, page 120. Open quote. Dérive. A technique of transient passage through variant ambiances. End quote, page 121. Open quote, unitary urbanism, the theory of the combined use of arts and techniques for the integral construction of a milieu in dynamic relation with experiments in behavior. End quote, page 121. Quick note, it looks like art plus science times focus on building human milieus equal unitary urbanism. But is it individual when we refer as unitary? Open quote. These definitions fit together like a set of Russian dolls. On the outside is the situationist movement, and beneath is its agenda to transform urban life, unitary urbanism. This, in turn, reveals its methodology, psychogeography, while this gives way to the twin techniques at its disposal, the dérive and détournement. End quote, page 121. Last note, isn't psychogeography science? Like a science itself? How can it be a methodology? If it's a method, then what is this science in this case?